What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with our next reaction. In this one, we have how Australian slang accidentally became the most effective code the US military could never crack. I'm thoroughly excited to hear this because Australian slang, although I've reacted to so much of it, it's still something that I absolutely cannot crack. Before we dive in, if you guys happen to enjoy, don't forget to subscribe, give a bit of thumbs up, and let's get right to it.
The American signals intelligence officer pressed his headphones tighter. He adjusted the frequency. He checked the equipment. He checked it again. The radio was functioning perfectly. The encryption was non-existent. The transmission was coming through in plain English, and he could not understand a single word. Not one. He rewound the tape, played it again. The voice was clearly speaking English, Australian English. The vowels were recognizable. The cadence was human. But the content might as well have been Mandarin. He wrote down what he heard, phonetically, letter by letter. Then he stared at his own handwriting and felt something he had never felt in 3 years of intercepting enemy communications. Confusion. Pure confusion. The year was 1942. The location was a joint Allied signals monitoring station in the South Pacific. The officer's name was Lieutenant Raymond Holt. He had spent 18 months decoding Imperial Japanese naval transmissions. He had cracked substitution ciphers. He had identified frequency hopping patterns. He had broken codes that the Japanese believed were unbreakable. And now he was being defeated by his own allies, not by their encryption, not by their technology, not by any deliberate security measure whatsoever, by the way they talked. "I need a translation," Holt said to his supervisor. He slid the transcript across the desk. Major Charles Whitfield picked it up. Read the first line. Read it again. Removed his glasses. Cleaned them. Put them back on. Read it a third time. "What language is this?" "English, sir. Australian English." Whitfield stared at the transcript. The words were there. Individual words he could identify, but strung together, they formed something that resisted comprehension the way a locked door resists a shoulder. "Get me someone who speaks Australian," Whitfield said. He was not joking. What happened next spans 2 wars, 3 decades, and one of the most accidentally brilliant communications advantages in modern military history. The Australian military never set out to create an unbreakable code. They never designed a cipher. They never developed a substitution system. They simply talked the way Australians talk. And it broke the brains of every signals intelligence team that tried to follow along. Allied.
This is legitimately hilarious. Like, they're not going out of their way to try to speak in code. They're not going out of their way to try to deceive the Americans. They're not going out of their way to hide what they are saying. They are simply speaking Australian slang. They're speaking English, but they're speaking Australian English, which may as well be, what did he say? May as well be Mandarin. He like, that is English. It's just like, none of it makes sense to me. That's hilarious, though, the fact that they're not even trying to hide any of it, any of their communications. They just, this is how they speak. This is their slang.
Brains of every signals intelligence team that tried to follow along, allied and enemy alike. This is that story. To understand what defeated Lieutenant Holt that night, you need to understand what Australian English actually is. Not the version you hear in films, not the sanitized export version with a few gays sprinkled in for flavor. The real thing. The dense, evolving, self-referencing, deliberately obscure language that Australian soldiers used among themselves. It was not slang in the way Americans understood slang. American slang was informal vocabulary. Australian slang was a parallel language. It had its own grammar, its own logic, its own rules of construction that were invisible to outsiders and instinctive to insiders. And it moved constantly. A term that meant one thing in January meant something different by March. A phrase coined in one battalion would spread to 3 others within a week, mutating as it traveled. New words appeared daily. Old words shifted meaning without warning. The language was alive in a way that no codebook could capture, because by the time you wrote the definition down, the definition had already changed. The Americans did not know this yet. They would learn. The first formal complaint arrived on the desk of Allied Signals Command in April 1942. A US Navy communications officer stationed at a joint operations center in Brisbane filed a report stating that Australian radio traffic was, and this is a direct quote from the document, incomprehensible to trained American signals personnel, despite being transmitted in the clear. In the clear. No encryption, no cipher, no code, just Australian. The report detailed a specific incident. An Australian infantry unit was coordinating a patrol near Kokoda. The radio operator transmitted a message that, when transcribed, read, "Tell Bluey the Wog's got him crook. He's chucking the wobbly. And if the brass don't send a tinny of the good stuff, he's going to go troppo before smoko."
Hold on. Tell. See? They already
read, "Tell Bluey.
Tell Bluey the Wogs got him crook." That's the
Wog's got him crook. He's chucking the wobbly.
He's throwing up. I know that the Wogs got him crook. So something about the food. Something about the food, wherever the food is from, it got him sick. He's throwing up.
And if the brass don't send a tinny of the good stuff, he's going to go troppo before smoko.
And if the higher ups don't send like a tinny of the good stuff, like I'm assuming like a canned food, like some sort of canned food, a can of the good stuff, of the good food, he's gonna go troppo before smoko. I don't know what troppo means. Assume smoko means before. Dang, I don't know what that. I assume smoko meant like a smoke break or something. He's gonna go troppo. He's gonna go crazy. He's gonna go. I don't know. I should a little bit, but.
American monitoring team transcribed every word correctly. They could not determine what any of it meant. Their analysis concluded it might be a coded message using agricultural terminology. They flagged it for further investigation. It was not a coded message. It was a soldier telling headquarters that a man named Bluey, which was not his real name. It was a nickname given because he had red hair.
Of course.
Because Australians call redheads Bluey. Because Australians name things by what they are not. Had contracted a tropical illness.
Okay.
Was having a breakdown. And if command didn't send some beer, he was going to lose his mind completely before the morning tea break. Every Australian who...
As you guys can tell, I absolutely butchered that. I got just him being sick, right? The rest of it, I got completely wrong.
Heard that message, understood it instantly. Every American who heard it was lost. We had blokes in the next room who could crack Japanese naval codes, said Corporal Dennis Gallagher, an Australian signals operator, stationed at the same facility. Proper genius types, could pull meaning out of 5-digit number groups, and they'd come to us with a transcript of our own blokes chatting on the radio and ask what it meant. Like we were the Rosetta Stone, Gallagher found it hilarious. The Americans did not find it hilarious. They found it operationally dangerous. And they were right to be concerned. Joint operations required communication. Communication required comprehension. Comprehension required a shared language. And the Australians, without trying, without planning, without any intention whatsoever, had created a language barrier inside their own alliance. Major Whitfield authorized the creation of what he called an Australian English translation glossary. It was a serious document. It was given a classified designation. It was treated with the same institutional seriousness as a Japanese codebook. A team of 4 American intelligence analysts was assigned to compile it. They interviewed Australian soldiers. They recorded conversations. They cross-referenced terms. They built definitions. The glossary took 11 weeks to complete. It was obsolete within 3. They gave us this booklet, said Staff Sergeant William Brennan, an American liaison officer attached to the Australian 9th Division. About 40 pages, alphabetized, very thorough. and the Australians thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. They started making up new words specifically because they knew we had the glossary. It became a game. A game. The Australians
Uh,
turned the Americans' attempt to understand them into sport. New terms appeared overnight. Old terms were deliberately repurposed. The glossary became not just outdated, but actively misleading, because the Australians, finding the entire situation deeply entertaining,
extremely.
began using terms from the glossary with inverted meanings, specifically to confuse anyone relying on it. This was not malicious. This was Australian.
They out here in the battlefield. They out here having fun. They're out here joking around. They're out here having a laugh, bro. They're having a laugh at the Americans' expense. It said they took these, cracking this slang, thinking that it's some kind of code, with the seriousness of them trying to crack Japanese coded messages, right? They took this 11 weeks to build a glossary, interviewing Australian soldiers, getting all of these things, putting definitions to each phrase, to each word. 11 weeks. And the thing was useless within 3 weeks of the Australians just used different words, or they used the same words and gave them different meanings, bro. They're out here just playing around. They're like, oh, this is okay. This is good. Let's see what glossary the Americans come up with next, and then we'll do it all over again. They're having a blast.
Need to understand something about the Australian relationship with language.
Oh,
Australians do not use language to communicate clearly. They use language to establish who is inside the group and who is outside the group. Clarity is a secondary function. The primary function is belonging. If you understand, you belong. If you do not understand, you do not belong.
dang.
And the language
That's
evolves
tough.
specifically to
That's
maintain
tough.
that boundary. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most effective in-group identification systems ever accidentally developed by any military force. The Japanese encountered the same wall. Imperial Japanese Signals Intelligence had invested enormous resources in learning English. Their best analysts had studied at American universities. They could read the New York Times. They could understand Roosevelt's speeches. They could decode American military jargon with reasonable accuracy. Australian radio traffic defeated them completely. A captured Japanese intelligence report from 1943 contained a section on Allied communications that is remarkable in its frustration. The report categorized American, British, and Australian radio traffic separately. American traffic was rated difficult but penetrable. British traffic was rated formal and predictable. Australian traffic was rated, and this translation has been verified by multiple historians, impossible. Suggest focusing resources elsewhere. Impossible. The
What?
Japanese gave up, not on breaking a code,
What?
not on defeating an encryption system. They gave up on understanding the way Australians naturally speak. The most sophisticated signals intelligence operation in the Pacific Theatre threw its hands up and walked away because a group of soldiers from Sydney, Melbourne, and the Queensland outback were talking the way they talked at the pub.
This is
Think about that for a moment.
crazy.
Every military in history has invested enormous resources in developing secure communications, cipher machines, encryption protocols, frequency hopping systems, one-time pads. The Americans had SIGABA, the British had Typex, the Germans had Enigma, the Japanese had Purple. Billions of dollars, thousands of the finest mathematical minds of a generation, all devoted to the problem of making communications unintelligible to the enemy. The Australians achieved the same result by talking normally. No machine, no algorithm, no key, just words. We didn't even know we were doing it, said Private Arthur Rawlings, an infantry radio man who served in New Guinea. We just talk, same way we talk at home,
Oh,
and apparently nobody could understand us.
this is crazy, bro. All of these countries are investing billions of dollars into coding their messages, basically, and trying to keep them as coded as possible so the enemy cannot crack the code. They cannot understand what they're trying to say. Billions of dollars. The Australians are just talking the way they talk at home, speaking the way that they speak in the pubs, and no one can decode their slang. No one can decode it. No, everybody's like, bro, they probably. I'm just imagining some geniuses in a room, like just sweating, just profusely, like looking at these Australian transcripts and say, like, I don't know. I can't crack it. This code has got to be one of the most genius things ever invented. The Australians are much more, uh, are far beyond our capabilities when it comes to communications. And the Aussies are just like, that's how we talk. Like, we not trying to fool nobody. We don't even know that y'all trying to decode our way of speaking.
Which, honestly, explained a lot about the looks the Yanks kept giving us. The specific mechanisms of Australian unintelligibility fall into several categories. Each one individually would cause problems for a non-Australian listener. Combined, they created something approaching a natural cipher. The first mechanism was rhyming slang, borrowed from Cockney London, but mutated beyond recognition. Australian rhyming slang replaced common words with rhyming phrases, then dropped the rhyming part, leaving only the non-rhyming word. So, telephone became dog and bone became simply dog. Look became Captain Cook became captain. Road became frog and toad became frog. An Australian soldier saying, "Get on the dog and tell the captain to check the frog," was asking someone to use the telephone to tell a person to look at the road. To an American ear, it was a sentence
What
about
the?
an animal, an officer, and an amphibian.
Yes.
It made no sense.
To
It would never
anybody.
make sense without the key, and the key was not written down anywhere because every Australian already had it. The second mechanism was abbreviation. Australians shortened everything,
Everything.
not occasionally, compulsively. Afternoon became arvo. Breakfast became brekkie. Ammunition became ammo, which the Americans also used, but then became the good gear, which they did not.
The good
Reconnaissance
gear.
became
Recce.
recce, pronounced recce, which the Americans heard as a proper name and spent hours trying to identify which soldier named Ricky was being discussed. Sergeant Peter Malloy of the 7th Division told a story that became famous in joint operations circles. We had an American officer sit in on a briefing, full operational briefing. Went for about 40 minutes. Maps, objectives, the lot. Afterwards, he came up to me and said he'd understood roughly 12% of what was said. 12%. And he wasn't thick. He had a degree from Princeton. He just couldn't follow us. 12%. The third mechanism was cultural reference. Australian slang drew heavily from cricket, horse racing, and rural life. Three domains that most Americans had zero familiarity with. A soldier who was on a sticky wicket was in trouble. Someone batting on a flat deck had it easy. A unit that had come a gutser had failed badly.
Oh.
A plan that was rough as guts was poorly conceived. An officer who was all hat and no cattle was incompetent. These phrases were not random. They followed internal logic.
That's crazy.
But the logic was invisible to anyone who had not grown up in the culture. The racing terms were the worst, admitted Captain Howard Jensen, an American intelligence officer who spent 6 months working alongside Australians in New Guinea. They'd say something was roughy odds, or a bloke was past the post, or they needed to scratch an operation. I grew up in Connecticut. I had never been to a horse race in my life. It was like they were speaking from inside a world I couldn't see.
Yeah.
A world he could not see. That is exactly what it was. The fourth mechanism,
That is absolutely 100% what it. Yeah. It's not a code that you can crack. You have to be a part of Australian culture. You got to almost be raised in it. You got to be around it. You got to immerse yourself in it to understand what they are saying. Otherwise, you never will. And then, like, you can write your glossaries and all that you want, but they can switch those meanings just like that. because in different, I feel like in different places in Australia, that slang stands for different things, and you learn all the different meanings that that slang has, and it's just dog and bone. I never knew that mean telephone. Then they switched it to just dog, and it's like, bro, they're without no billion-dollar machines, bro. They became the most impossible communications for countries to understand. It's crazy.
Perhaps the most maddening for outsiders was deliberate inversion. Australians routinely said the opposite of what they meant. A large man was called tiny. A bald man was called curly. A stupid plan was bloody brilliant. A dangerous mission was a bit of a picnic. A terrified soldier was relaxed as. This was not sarcasm in the way Americans understood sarcasm. American sarcasm was obvious,
Yes,
signaled by tone.
very
Australian
obvious.
inversion was seamless. The tone did not change. The delivery was flat. You either knew it was inverted or you did not. And the Americans did not. Multiple instances are documented where American officers took Australian descriptions at face value and reached wildly wrong conclusions. In one case, an Australian liaison reported that an upcoming patrol route was quiet as a church mouse, mate, nothing to worry about. The American commander interpreted this as confirmation that the route was safe. The Australian had meant the exact opposite. The route was extremely dangerous. Nothing to worry about meant everything to worry about.
Oh
The
my
patrol was
days.
redirected only because a second Australian officer intervened and, in an act of extraordinary cultural translation, said, "He means it's bad, sir, real bad." The American stared at the Australian. Then why did he say there was nothing to worry about? Because there's everything to worry about. That doesn't make sense. It does if you're Australian. It does if you are Australian. The fifth
Yeah.
mechanism was speed. Australian soldiers spoke fast, extraordinarily fast. Words ran together. Consonants dropped. Vowels shifted. Good day. How are you going? Became G'day, how you going?
Good
A
eye,
single
yeah.
sonic event that registered to American ears as one indistinguishable word. What happened to him became whoppened to him. Military terminology suffered the same compression. What is the situation at the forward observation post became was it like up the OP. 4 words, delivered in under a second, containing an entire tactical question. The speed was not affected for radio. This was simply how they spoke. And on radio, without visual cues, without context, without the ability to ask someone to slow down, because asking an Australian soldier to slow down was culturally the equivalent of admitting you did not belong. The speed was ruinous to comprehension. Lieutenant Holt, the signals officer who started this story, eventually compiled a report on Australian communications that ran to
Impossible.
67 pages. It was titled Linguistic Challenges in Allied Radio Traffic,
67.
the Australian Problem. It was classified. It circulated among senior American signals intelligence staff. Its central recommendation was extraordinary. Do not attempt to decode Australian voice communications using standard analytical methods.
There you
Holt
go.
wrote, the language system is self-modifying and culturally encrypted beyond the capacity of conventional signals intelligence to penetrate. Recommend assigning native Australian speakers to all joint monitoring stations. Culturally encrypted. An American signals intelligence officer used the term culturally encrypted to describe the way Australians talk, not as a metaphor, as a formal analytical classification. The report caused a stir. Some officers dismissed it as an exaggeration. Others recognized the operational reality. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the Allied forces in the South Pacific and had a complicated relationship with the Australians under his command, was reportedly briefed on the issue. His response is not recorded in official documents, but an aide's memoir recalls him saying, "If we can't understand them, neither can the Japanese. Leave it. Leave it." MacArthur, perhaps unwittingly,
I mean, that's a very good point here. If we can't understand them, then it can't nobody understand them. We speak the same language as them, and we can't understand them. The Japanese don't speak English. You know, I'm sure many of them learn English for code cracking, um, code cracking abilities. Sorry, shoot. But it's like we've spoken English our entire lives, and we don't get them. Ain't no way the Japanese gonna get them because this ain't about just the language that you're speaking. It's about the culture. And unless you're ingrained in the culture, I don't care how much code crackers or decryption breakers you got, you ain't gonna crack it. And so they like, hey, put an Australian with everybody. That's the only way we can understand this. Is put an Australian soldier with everybody to help translate it for us. But they like let them continue to speak the way they speak, cause Australia the Japanese ain't gonna have no idea what they saying either.
Neither can the Japanese. Leave it. Leave it. MacArthur, perhaps unwittingly, had identified the strategic advantage. The Australians' natural speech patterns were providing communication security that no machine could match. Because a machine-generated code can be broken by a machine, a culturally generated code cannot. There is no algorithm for understanding that she'll be right means either everything is fine or everything is terrible, depending on context that exists only in the shared experience of the speaker and the listener.
Oh, that's
You
amazing.
cannot crack what was never encoded. The war
Facts.
ended. The problem did not. When Australian forces deployed to Korea in 1950, American signals teams encountered the same wall. The slang had evolved. New terms had replaced old ones. The glossary from World War II was useless, not outdated by years, but by an entirely new generation of vocabulary. And then came Vietnam, and Vietnam made everything worse. The Australian task force that deployed to Phuoc Thu province in 1966 brought with it a new generation of slang that had evolved through 2 decades of peacetime, absorbing influences from rock and roll, television, immigration, and the specific culture of national service conscription. The old slang was still there, underneath. But layered on top was a new vocabulary that was even more impenetrable than its predecessor. The Vietnam-era stuff was next level, said Corporal James Tierney, an American signals analyst stationed at Long Bin. At least with the World War II guys, you could sometimes pick out individual words. The Vietnam-era Australians are not even sure they were using words. It was more like sounds. Sounds that happened to carry meaning if you were from the right postcode in Melbourne. The right postcode in Melbourne. That specificity was real. Australian slang was not uniform. It varied by state, by city,
Exactly.
by neighbourhood. A soldier from Western Sydney used different terms than a soldier from rural Queensland. A conscript from Melbourne spoke differently than a regular from Darwin, and they all understood each other because the system was flexible enough to accommodate regional variation while remaining completely opaque to outsiders. The Americans tried again. A new glossary was commissioned. This one was more ambitious. It included not just vocabulary, but pronunciation guides, cultural notes, and context indicators. It was 212 pages long. It was distributed to every American signal station in Vietnam. It lasted 6 weeks. They gave us this enormous manual, said Private First Class Stephen Caruso, a radio operator at Nui Dat. The Australians found a copy. Within a day, they were using every term in it wrong, on purpose, over open radio, laughing. The Australians found the entire enterprise hilarious,
I'm sure.
and their laughter was not just entertainment, it was. Whether they knew it or not, the mechanism by which the code stayed unbreakable. Every time the Americans tried to standardize their understanding, the Australians destabilized it.
Bro, I know they're just having the best of times. Like, how they keep getting their hands on copies of this glossary is what I want to understand. But I know they're just having the best of times, and the inside jokes are absolutely going insane. And they're just over there cracking up. And that's Australia for you. That is Australia for you. I can't imagine all the stress that the Americans are going through to put this 212-page glossary together for it to only last 6 weeks, right? You probably read it in a couple days, and then it probably takes you a while to memorize everything. So you don't have to keep going back to it, I'd assume. And then they're just like, well, let's just switch it up again. You can't do anything. You have to be involved. You have to be immersed in the culture. And like I said earlier, from different territories, from different states in Australia, the slang is going to switch up, but they still understand it. They still get it. they know this range of words all could mean this one thing, depending on the context. And so it's like, oh, you from Melbourne, I'm from Brisbane, he's from Tassie. We can all understand each other clearly, even though we use different slang words.
Not through a security protocol, through humor. Humor as encryption. It sounds absurd. It was absurdly effective. In Vietnam, the practical consequences went beyond mere confusion. Joint operations required precise coordination. Fire missions required exact language. Medevac calls required clarity. And in each of these domains, the language barrier created genuine operational friction. But it also created something else, something that nobody had planned and nobody fully understood until years later. Security. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had extensive signals intelligence capabilities. They monitored Allied radio traffic constantly. They had English-speaking analysts. They could, and regularly did, intercept American communications and extract useful intelligence. American units were required to use strict communications protocols, call signs, and coded references, specifically because the enemy was listening. The Australians used none of this. They transmitted in the clear. They used real names. They discussed real objectives. They described real positions. And it did not matter, because the enemy could not understand them. A captured North Vietnamese signals intelligence report from 1968 contains a passage about Australian communications that echoes the Japanese report from 25 years earlier. The NVA analyst wrote that Australian radio traffic uses an unknown dialect that does not correspond to any English language training materials. Attempts at translation have produced contradictory results. Resources are better allocated to monitoring American frequencies. Unknown dialect. The same conclusion, 25 years apart. Two different enemies, two different wars, two different continents. The same result. The Australians were unintelligible. We knew the VC were listening, said Sergeant Malcolm Fraser, no relation to the Prime Minister, who served as a platoon radio operator in Phuoc Tui. We didn't care. What were they going to do with it? We'd say something like, tell Davo the mozzie net's a cactus and we need a few durries before we head bush. The VC could transcribe every syllable and still not know we needed mosquito nets and cigarettes before going on patrol. He paused. Actually, I reckon our own headquarters didn't always know what we meant either, but they had the good sense not to ask. The good sense not to ask. That was another layer of the Australian communications culture. Asking for clarification was seen as a sign of weakness, of not belonging. So even when Australian officers did not fully understand a transmission from the field, they would interpret it using context, intuition, and shared cultural knowledge, rather than requesting a repeat. The system was self-reinforcing. Ambiguity was tolerated. Precision was sacrificed for speed and belonging. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Not always. There were failures. Friendly fire incidents where coordinates were mangled by slang. Supply requests that arrived wrong because the terminology was misunderstood. Up the chain. Medical evacuations delayed because the severity of injuries was described in language that headquarters interpreted as less urgent than intended. These failures were real. They cost lives, and they were the price of a communications system that nobody had designed and nobody could control. But the failures were individual. The systemic advantage was enormous. Australian units in Vietnam operated with a level of communications security that American units, bound by formal protocols, codebooks and encryption schedules, could not match. Because the Australian code could not be compromised. There was no codebook to capture, no encryption device to seize, no key to steal. The encryption lived in the heads of every Australian soldier, and it changed every day, and it was different in every unit, and it was reinforced by every conversation. You could not break it, because it was not a system. It was a culture. Captain Howard Nichols, a U.S. Army signals...
Crazy. It's like, yeah, you could not break it because it was a system, right? It wasn't a system. It was a culture. You can't crack it, but it is sad to know that, right? Because of the slang that they were using, because it was not a system that was uniform across everywhere. and that even when officers didn't understand, that they didn't ask for clarification because they didn't want to, I guess, be seen as they didn't want it to be seen as a sign of weakness. So they just kind of used their best judgment to try to understand what was said. That sometimes is caused friendly fire, delays in a medical team, wrong resources going to the wrong places, and so these things are setbacks from the system that they used. And he said it did cost lives, so that is a heartbreaking thing about the Aussie slang that they were using. But at the same time, the enormous advantage that it gave Australia, and for them not to even have to pay $1 while these other countries are paying billions to encrypt their messages. They're paying nothing. This is how they speak. This is their slang. They're paying nothing to encrypt their messages, yet they are the most impossible messages for any other country to encrypt. And when it comes to communications, that is one of the most important things when it comes to war.
Intelligence officer who conducted a post-war study of Allied communication security, wrote a passage that captured the paradox perfectly. The Australian approach to tactical communications was, by every measurable standard, the least secure in the Allied force structure.
It's
No
crazy.
encryption, no authentication protocols, minimal call sign discipline, extensive use of plain language. And yet, in practical terms, their communications were the most secure of any unit in theatre. The reason is simple and deeply uncomfortable for those of us in the signals intelligence community. Their plain language was more effective than our encryption, not because it was designed to be, but because it evolved to be. Evolved. That is the critical word. The Australian slang was not static. It was not designed. It was an evolutionary system. Like a living organism, it adapted to its environment. And one of the pressures it adapted to, unconsciously, organically, without any institutional guidance, was the presence of listeners who did not belong. The slang did not just identify insiders, it actively repelled outsiders. New terms emerged, not through committee, but through use. Terms that stuck were terms that worked, that communicated meaning to insiders while obscuring it from everyone else. Terms that failed, that were too transparent, too easily understood by outsiders, died naturally. The fittest survived. The most opaque thrived. It was natural selection applied to language, and the result was a communication system that was optimized through decades of unconscious pressure to be unintelligible to anyone who was not Australian. Darwin would have appreciated the irony. An Australian city, an evolutionary principle, applied to Australian soldiers defeating foreign intelligence services through the natural evolution of speech. The Americans made one final attempt. In 1969, the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, commissioned what it called the Australian Vernacular Project. It was the most ambitious effort yet. A team of linguists, actual academic linguists, not intelligence analysts, was brought in. They were embedded with Australian units. They recorded hundreds of hours of radio traffic. They conducted interviews. They mapped dialectal variations. They traced etymologies. They built a comprehensive linguistic database. The project took 14 months. Its final report ran to over 400 pages. Its conclusion was damning. The Australian military vernacular, the report stated, constitutes a dynamic sociolect that resists systematization. Its core vocabulary shifts at a rate that exceeds the capacity of any static reference system to track. Its meaning is determined not by lexical content, but by pragmatic context, speaker identity, unit affiliation, and shared experiential reference. No translation guide, however comprehensive, can substitute for native speaker competence. No translation guide can substitute for native speaker competence. 14 months, 400 pages, and the conclusion was, you either grow up Australian or you do not understand. The project was archived. Its recommendations were simple and profound. Stop trying to decode Australian communications. Start embedding Australian liaison personnel in every joint signals operation. Accept that the language barrier is permanent and structural. Accept it. The American military, the most powerful, most technologically advanced, most resource-rich military in the history of the world, formally accepted that it could not understand the way Australians talk. There is a coda to this story, several in fact. The first involves a man named Warrant Officer Kevin Doyle. Doyle served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1969 as a signals specialist. After the war, he was recruited by the Australian Defence Signals Directorate, the Australian equivalent of the NSA, specifically because of his work in Vietnam. His assignment was extraordinary. Doyle was asked to study whether Australian slang could be deliberately weaponized as a communications security system. Not accidental security, intentional security. A formal protocol that would leverage the natural opacity of Australian English as a supplement to electronic encryption. The project was classified. Its details remain largely unavailable.
It's
But
crazy. They spent 14 months trying to crack it. One more, they said, let's give it one more shot. 14 months, over 400 pages, so many radio transmissions, so many conversations embedded in the Australian infantry, all of these things to come up with the conclusion that, bro, unless you grow up there, you're just not going to understand it. Like, it's as simple as that. Unless you grow up there, you're not going to understand it. Because everything is dependent upon the speaker, upon where the speaker's from, upon context, upon all of these different things that two speakers could say the exact same thing and have completely different meanings. But they would both be understood by the people that were around them because they knew that person and they knew where they came from and they knew all these things about them. So it's like, unless you got the time to get to sit down and know every single member of the Australian military and memorize them, then, or unless you can go back in time and grow up in Australia, then it's pointless to try to it's pointless to try to figure out what they're saying.
His memoir, published in 2004, reveals its central finding. You can't weaponize it, Doyle wrote. That's the whole point. The moment you try to formalize it, standardize it, write it down in a manual, it stops working. It works because it's natural, because it's alive, because it changes. The moment you pin it down, it dies. And a dead language is a crackable language. A dead language is a crackable language. Doyle had identified the fundamental paradox. The security value of Australian slang lay precisely in its uncontrollability. The same quality that made it maddening for Allied signals teams. Its constant evolution, its resistance to standardization, its refusal to hold still, was exactly what made it impenetrable to enemies. You could not harness it without killing it. You could not systematize it without destroying the very quality that made it secure. The second coda involves the Japanese. After the war, captured Japanese signals intelligence files revealed the full extent of their failure with Australian communications. The files showed that the Japanese had dedicated a team of 12 analysts specifically to Australian radio traffic. The team worked for 18 months. They produced over 3,000 pages of analysis. They identified approximately 600 individual slang terms and managed to define roughly half of them correctly. But their definitions were snapshots, frozen in time. By the time the definitions were compiled, reviewed, approved, and distributed, the terms had moved on.
Of course.
New meanings had attached themselves. Old meanings had shifted. The 600 terms the Japanese had catalogued were ghosts. Linguistic fossils, accurate descriptions of a language that no longer existed in the form they had captured. The team leader, a lieutenant commander whose name appears in the records as Takeda, wrote a final assessment that was discovered in 1946. It is remarkably honest. The Australian language problem is not one of intelligence or resources, Takeda wrote. It is one of time. The language moves faster than analysis can follow. By the time we understand what a term means, it means something else. We are always behind. We will always be behind. This is not a solvable problem. Not a solvable problem. A Japanese intelligence officer, trained, dedicated, working with substantial resources, concluded that understanding Australian English was not a solvable problem. Not a difficult problem. Not an expensive problem. An impossible one. The third coda is perhaps the most remarkable. It involves not the Second World War or Vietnam, but a training exercise in 1983. Australian and American forces were conducting joint maneuvers in northern Queensland. As part of the exercise, an American signals intelligence team was tasked with monitoring Australian radio traffic and extracting operational intelligence. The exercise lasted 2 weeks. The American team extracted zero actionable intelligence from Australian voice communications.
Yeah.
Zero. They intercepted every transmission. They recorded every word. They had native English speakers. They had the Australian Vernacular Project report from 1969. They had 14 years of additional linguistic research. They had computers. They got nothing. It was humbling.
It's like, when y'all gonna understand that y'all ain't never gonna understand it? When are you gonna come to that understanding? But yeah, but the good thing is that the enemy, right? They put all of these people onto this job and trying to understand them, and the enemy only gets about half of their phrases right, and the half that they got right were just right in that moment of time. But you fast forward a week, and now all those phrases mean something completely different, and so it's like everything that you had right is now scratched. And it's like you got all these people putting in all this time, putting in all these hours. You're putting in all this money to try to understand and crack the code that these Australians speak in, but it's not a code that can be cracked. It's either you're from Australia or you're not. That's the only way to understand. So that is the absolutely amazing thing. The good thing, Australia's an ally.
Said Major Robert Langford, who led the American signals team. We're supposed to be the best in the world at this. We break Soviet codes. We intercept Chinese military communications. We monitor half the planet. And we couldn't understand a bunch of Australians talking on the radio about where they were having lunch. Where they were having lunch. The Australians, of course, found this hysterically funny. An unofficial award was created within the Australian unit. A hand-drawn certificate declaring the recipient most unintelligible communicator. It was given to Corporal Brian Hutchins, a radio operator from rural Tasmania, whose accent was so thick that even other Australians occasionally struggled. Hutcho was a legend, said one of his section mates. You could be standing next to him, face to face, broad daylight, and still not catch half of what he said. On the radio, forget it. He was basically a one-man encryption device. A one-man encryption device. That is what decades of evolution, culture, humor, and sheer Australianness had produced. Not a technology, not a system, not a protocol. A way of being that was, as a side effect of simply existing, more secure than anything the most advanced military in the world could build. The Americans never solved the problem. They adapted to it. Australian liaison officers became standard in joint operations.
There you go.
Dedicated Australian signals personnel were embedded in American headquarters. A quiet, pragmatic accommodation was reached. The Americans accepted that they would never understand. The Australians accepted that they would always need to translate. And the slang kept evolving. Through East Timor, through Iraq, through Afghanistan, every generation adding layers, every deployment creating new terms, every shared experience building new walls of meaning that only those who were there could penetrate. It is still happening now, right now. Somewhere in an Australian barracks, a soldier is using a word that did not exist yesterday, a word that perfectly captures a shared experience in a way that no outsider will ever understand, a word that will spread through the unit, through the brigade, through the force, a word that will defeat any listening ear that does not belong. The most effective code is the one nobody built.
Facts.
The Australians never cracked a cipher. They never built a machine. They never hired a mathematician. They just talked. And in talking, in being relentlessly, unapologetically, incomprehensibly Australian, they created something that 3 enemies across 3 wars could not break. Not because it was clever, because it was alive, because it was Australian, and because you cannot crack what was never a code in the first place.
That was so awesome to get the opportunity to react to. Like, that was so fun and legitimately amazing. Yeah, it's just a language. You're either born in Australia or not. And if you're not, you're not going to understand it. If you are, then you probably are. Simple in that it's nothing any computer can catch on to and any system can figure out and break down for you, because they could say one thing one day and it have this meaning, and then say it the next day and it have a completely different meaning. You have to know each and every Australian officer. You have to know their personality and what context they speak in, and how that you have to know too much information that not even a supercomputer could get. So this was incredible. Shout out to Australia. Shout out to y'all for speaking, just using your slang and creating the most uncrackable code. It sounds like in the history of militaries. I love you guys. I'll see y'all on the next one. I can't wait. Legitimately amazing. Uh, yeah, it's just a language. You're either born in Australia or not. And if you're not, you're not going to understand it. If you are, then you probably are. Simple in that it's nothing any computer can catch on to and any system can figure out and break down for you, because they could say one thing one day and it have this meaning, and then say it the next day and it have a completely different meaning. You have to know each and every Australian officer. You have to know their personality and what context they speak in, and how that you have to know too much information that not even a supercomputer could get. So this was incredible. Shout out to Australia. Shout out to y'all for speaking, just using your slang and creating the most uncrackable code. It sounds like in the history of militaries. I love you guys. I'll see y'all on the next one. I can't wait.